morning, Year 8. So obviously our last two lessons have started us on our journey into Gothic fiction, and we started to have a look at a couple of the conventions of Gothic fiction, and you also had a little go at creating your own either setting of a Gothic fiction novel or a character. So what I'd like to know is just what have you learned so far? Are there certain conventions that are really standing out to you? Are there certain features that are really standing out to you? What's the difference between Gothic with a capital G and Gothic with a lowercase g? Can you remember the first Gothic novel that we had a look at? So whatever you have learnt so far. So we're going to build on that knowledge that you've already got of the Gothic fiction, and hopefully by the end of today's lesson you're going to have a clear set of features in your mind as to what makes something Gothic. So what I've got are a couple of images on the next few slides, and you're going to have to do a little bit of inference work. So anyone who doesn't know what the word inference is, we used it last time in our poetry. It's about reading between the lines basically and trying to read into images and quotations. So what I'd like you to think about is, for each of the pictures, what do you think makes them Gothic? And what links and connections can you make between the pictures and what we've talked about already in terms of Gothic features? And do you think that the image fits convincingly into the Gothic genre? If yes, why? And if not, why? Okay, so you might want to write those questions down so you know what you're looking for in each of the pictures. Again, I am aware that you won't be able to print the pictures off, so don't worry about annotating them as such, but you can always label them, so slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, slide 4. Okay? So these are two images linked to the same novel, okay? And I want you to have a look for any of the Gothic features that we've discussed previously. So we'll have a think about the weather, have a think about the colour scheme that's been used, have a think about the surrounding setting, have a think about facial expressions. They're all linked to the Gothic, and write down for me what connections you can make between these and the Gothic. And also I want to know, do you think they are convincing in their Gothic literature theme, or do you think that perhaps maybe they're not as scary as you might expect for Gothic literature? And I'd like you to do that for the next couple of slides. So what I'm hoping you've realised is that there are some reoccurring themes that seem to happen in all of these images, and they are all linked to Gothic fiction texts. So the first one is linked to Dr. Jekyll and Hyde. This one that's on this slide is Dracula. Okay, and hopefully the images are representing some of the Gothic features that we're going to have a look at in a little bit more depth together today. So our next couple of slides is going to be a lot of information. It's going to be me talking at you quite a bit, which, you know, I only do on occasion really. But I would like you to make lots of notes, okay? It's up to you how you make notes. So if you want to use a mind map, if you prefer lists, if you want to use boxes, but we're essentially going to go through some of the conventions that I would expect you to be looking out for or using in your own work at this point, okay? So we're going to start off with some of the features that we would say are part of Gothic fiction, okay? So the first one is the themes of mystery and fear. Okay, so one of the crucial components of a captivating Gothic story evokes feelings of suspense and fear. Anything that is beyond scientific understanding lends way to mystery, and Gothic atmospheres leverage this principle. So many Gothic work contains scenes, events and objects such as burials, flickering candles, evil potions and other frightful concepts. So mystery and fear are a key component of any Gothic fiction piece, and they are absolutely things that you should be looking out for when you are analysing Gothic fiction texts, but also when you are creating your own. So one of the second features of Gothic fiction is omens and curses. Okay, so foreshadowing, a literary device which is used to hint at events to come, occurs in the forms of visions, omens and curses throughout many narratives in Gothic literature. Often tragedies are preceded by bad luck, intended to derail the lives of main characters. For example, an object might fall and break, or a shadowy figure might be lurking in the dark. Edgar Allan Poe uses this element in his short story The Black Cat, published in 1843. The superstitious nature of the title is ominous in itself, and Poe furthers the foreshadowing by naming one of the cats Pluto, a reference to the god of the dead in Roman mythology. So the idea of omens and curses is that there's always some sort of kind of dark history behind that's going to link onto something that's going to happen later on in the novel or in the text or in the film. So if you think obviously about Harry Potter, we said that that was a Gothic fiction text last lesson. Obviously Harry being able to talk to the snake in the first, in the second one when they go to the zoo, that is a foreshadowing for later on when he learns that he can speak Parseltongue. But it also lends into this kind of curse, because we then realise that obviously only he and Voldemort are the ones who are able to speak in Parseltongue. So those sorts of ideas are continued throughout the novel and developed and further expanded, and it's a typical feature of Gothic fiction. Atmosphere and setting. So Gothic novelists set the tone by carefully choosing the physical location of a scene, as the atmosphere and environment of a Gothic novel directly contribute to the feelings of fear and uneasiness. So if you think back to that picture that we looked at in our second lesson together, that house being isolated on its own in the middle of a marsh is exactly the sort of thing that a Gothic fiction writer would look for. Something where people, you know, if there's pain being inflicted inside, nobody can hear, and if anyone tries to escape, there is no escape. So authors often use settings like dark forests, unnerving mountain regions, ominous climatic conditions and threatening storms, castles, and romanticised in the medieval period, played a large role in early Gothic writings. So Mary Shelley is obviously a very famous Gothic writer. She was the one who wrote Frankenstein, in case you don't know. She sets her scenes amid creepy locations such as graveyards, gloomy castles, and obviously that feeds into the persona of the grotesque monster to emphasise this eerie atmosphere. So atmosphere and setting is very important for Gothic fiction, and they will usually be the sorts of places that people wouldn't want to be. You know, graveyards, empty houses, abandoned houses, castles, potential areas that have ghosts or spirits influencing them. You know, essentially somewhere people would not want to go. So make sure you've made some notes. You don't need to copy all of this down. You just need to have an understanding that basically mystery and fear, omens and curses, and atmosphere and setting are all Gothic conventions, and they're set stereotypes that we'd expect to see. So the next three, again, are some more conventions that we would expect to see in Gothic fiction. So the first one is supernatural and paranormal activity. So much of Gothic literature allure comes from the genre suggestion of a supernatural or an inexplicable events, such as inanimate objects coming to life, ghosts, spirits and vampires, like of that of Bram Stoker's 1987 Gothic fantasy Dracula. So there tends to be some sort of supernatural influence within Gothic fiction. So that can be, you know, supernatural creatures such as vampires and werewolves, that sort of thing. Or it can be spirits and ghosts, that sort of thing. Or it can be inexplicable events, which links to paranormal activity, so things that can't be explained, okay? And again, you tend to see something like that if it was a Gothic fiction piece of text. So obviously, if we go back to the example of Harry Potter, we know that there's ghosts, don't we, because they roam around the hallways. You can think about the three-headed dog that protects. You can think about the Philosopher's Stone. You know, they're all things that don't necessarily have a, you know, scientific explanation to them, but actually they provide quite a lot of the text. 5, romance. I know, boys, we moved away from Romeo and Juliet, and you thought you'd left all the lovey-gooey, dewy, snubbly stuff behind, but you haven't. So it's widely believed that Gothic literature stemmed from Romantic literature, so the two genres share overlapping characteristics. So many Gothic novels are plagued by a passionate romance that often leads to sorrow and tragedy. So Charles Dickens' work is centred on the romantic style love affair, but also featured horrific villains and Gothic settings. In the Victorian era, Gothic novels even provided an outlet for exploration of sexuality, as seen in Edgar Allan Poe's Annabel Lee. So obviously when Gothic fiction first came around and when it was very popular in the Victorian period, it was a way of kind of expressing things that people weren't really allowed to think about. So sexuality being one of those things. So obviously heterosexuality was the only thing that was accepted. So homosexuality was seen as being illegal and criminal, and people were put in prison for it. Also, though, women being able to explore their sexuality, because obviously it was a patriarchal society, so they weren't supposed to have sex until they were married. And the idea is that they were only supposed to have sex to have, you know, to create children. So actually, some people use this Gothic novel and this romantic element as a way of kind of, you know, explaining their frustrations towards the restrictions that were placed on them within society. And, you know, romance always leads to tragedy, and tragedy is quite a large part of Gothic fiction. So a romance that goes bad is what you tend to find in Gothic fiction, rather than it having a happy, loving ending, which I'm sure you boys will enjoy. Yeah, so you're not very happy with the romantic stuff I've picked up in lesson. And then villains. So much like that of various literary genres, villains play a pivotal role in Gothic literature. In traditional Gothic novels, villains took the form of autocratic male characters, often in authoritative positions like that of priests or kings. They're complex and initially sympathetic as to fool the reader of their deceptive nature. So villains like Dracula and Mr. Hyde are examples of complex villainous characters. So originally, villains used to be really easy to pick out, and sometimes, you know, in modern day films, they're really easy to pick out, aren't they, because of the stereotypes attached to them. But actually what Gothic fiction allowed for was a more complex version of a villain. So for example, Dracula, you know, he was just trying to protect himself at points throughout the novella, but actually, you know, he was a very serious kind of harmful creature as regards to humans. And that was where that kind of complexity came from. And the same with Mr. Hyde, well, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The idea was that this person had split personality disorder, and obviously one of the characters was very aggressive and very kind of mean and cruel, whilst the other one was very sympathetic and empathetic. And obviously the idea is that, can you really blame a whole character if they're two separate characters in one person? And that's where complexity came from. So Gothic fiction does try to branch out a little bit and create these more kind of, you know, controversial characters. Again, think about Frankenstein. You know, he's a monster who's created. All he seeks out is actual affection and love and wants to be treated as a human, and he never receives that and is then made out to be this monster within society. So villains are very much a common factor of Gothic fiction as well. These are the final couple. I appreciate it has been a lot of information today, but obviously these are the really interesting bits I think about Gothic fiction. So number 7 is emotional distress. So often Gothic writers use melodrama or high emotion to convey a thought. This is exaggerated, impassioned language helps convey the panic and terror inherent in merry characters. Themes of madness and emotional distress were seen in many of the 20th century Gothic novels and depicted the conditions of psychosis. For example, Charlotte Perkins Gilmore's short story The Yellow Wallpaper is written from the perspective of a woman suffering from postpartum depression. So the idea was that it's not just about things being scary or terrifying or creating an emotional response. It's about the fact that they create an exaggerated emotional response. So, you know, there's not just a noise upstairs and you walk upstairs to find out what it is and you realise it's your cat. You know, there's a genuine spirit upstairs that you are going to have to fend off and save other people's lives and your own life from. So that melodrama is really what Gothic fiction lends itself to. And we might say it's a bit cheesy nowadays because obviously there's been so many spoofy horror films created out of Gothic fiction. But actually, you know, it's one of the most enjoyable parts, thinking about the madness and the distress of the characters. 8, nightmares, obviously. You know, nightmares serve as a particularly important omen within Gothic literature. Nightmares have an ancient association with the act of foretelling and were used to exasperate the haunting aspects of a novel's plot. The dreams allow authors to better demonstrate the emotions of their characters in a more immediate and frightening state. So Stephen King's Bag of Bones depicts that Mike Noonan, a character played by nightmares, of frightening visions, including the death of his wife. So what they'd often do is use dreams to foreshadow what was going to come and happen next. So if you were going to kill a character off, you'd have the heroine, you know, dreaming that the love of her life is going to be killed, and then it's going to happen, and there's nothing she can do about it. And obviously she's pre-seen it, so you'd technically think there would be something she can do about it. So nightmares play a large part in it. And obviously that idea that the reality of a Gothic fiction novel is a nightmare. The anti-hero. So more often than not, the protagonist takes the form of an anti-hero, so a flawed protagonist with monstrous elements popularised by this genre of writing. So originally protagonists were males as well, but as the feminist movement emerged, English novelists like Clara Reeve began introducing female protagonists into their book. So the idea of being an anti-hero is that you know, they're not perfect. They perhaps have got qualities that we wouldn't like, and perhaps have done things in the past that would have made them non-heroic. Think about Shrek. I know it's not Gothic fiction as such, but Shrek is an anti-hero, isn't he? You know, he's not what we'd expect from a hero, but he actually completes heroic acts, and he completes them better than the supposed hero characters. And then number 10, a good old damsel in distress. So Gothic works often include a woman who suffers at the expense of a villain. They carry feelings of sadness, oppression and loneliness, and many were depicted as virginal in early Gothic pieces. The damsel's character is often held captive in a castle, terrorised by a noble and rendered powerless. The brooding woman appealed to the reader's pathos, particularly Walpole's character Matilda, whose unwavering loyalty to her father ultimately makes her weak and a potential victim. So the idea is that obviously women are weak and vulnerable. It's not very often we have really strong, heroic female characters within Gothic literature, more so in the more modern versions, but obviously in the past when patriarchal societies were a thing, you know, there did tend to be a little bit less in terms of that kind of support. So make sure that you've got all of these written down for me. They're all really important factors, and they're things that we're going to build on throughout our next couple of lessons and have a look at within actual texts. Just as kind of a final task today, I thought it'd be good to do a Gothic true or false quiz. Okay, so based on what we've learned today, does Gothic fiction explore how the past can come back to haunt the present? Would you say that that's true or false? Have a go. Gothic fiction is optimistic. True or false? Gothic fiction explores the parts of our lives we would rather not face. True or false? Gothic fiction combines part of the horror, crime and romance genres. And Gothic fiction shows how powerful human beings are. So just have a think about those for a couple of minutes for me. Which ones are true and which ones are false? Okay then, so hopefully you've had a think about these. So the first one said, Gothic fiction explores how the past can come back to haunt the present. I'm hoping that you have picked out that this is true. So we obviously spoke about how quite a lot of Gothic fiction tales foreshadow events, so things that have happened in the past become truth, or, you know, curses and omens that have gone from the past move through to the present. So this is very important, and quite often Gothic fiction does refer to something that's happened in the past and now it's coming back to haunt people. Gothic fiction is optimistic. I'm hoping you've recognised that that is absolutely false. Optimistic is definitely not a word I would use when thinking about Gothic fiction. Optimistic obviously means that you look for the positives in things. Gothic fiction is absolutely not that. The next one, Gothic fiction explores the parts of our lives we would rather not face. There's a little bit of truth to that, really. You know, it's not absolutely about that, but there definitely is an element of, you know, looking at things that we perhaps don't understand that we enjoy, and that sort of idea. Gothic fiction combines parts of the horror, crime and romance dramas. So we spoke about the romance genre specifically, but horror and crime do feed quite heavily into Gothic fiction as well. And Gothic fiction shows how powerful human beings are. Sometimes it can, but also it can also show how weak and vulnerable we are. So it's kind of a true and a false, to be honest. But I hope you've enjoyed that lesson, and I hope you've now got a wonderful page of Gothic features that you can use moving forward. Next lesson, we're going to have a look at our first Gothic text and see if we can identify some of those features within it. But I hope you're enjoying this unit as much as I am, and there's a show my homework quiz for you to complete at the end.